Nyeba gunle namdul shing yunde gunge genbabu simchen gunge nye chikbu tamche kenla gunchanse. Wame chegi yenge podane dusum sange gunge ngawo ni rasem chugu masumandan zebe. Sabe lame shabla so waine. Tomar antambichu nyamsulembi kulon sambo ngechungi sambatang chachu semki penyen tang dajezingi nimi laso pa tenshimbe koni dambichu tebatang sambe koni nyamsulembi shu.
In the beginning, please engender the excellent motivation for practicing the Dharma, which is twofold, that of renunciation and bodhicitta. Please also recollect the benefits of bodhicitta, mind of awakening, and faults of self-grasping mind. And then in that spirit, please listen to the teachings.
Danganzu lamgi chake chimbu jir lamgi rimbatang jirado chake chimbu ki lamgi rimbakola shubi kabre. Tade nani kasang lam tokche ki shirap sumyobe nani gomchungi shirap lingi shubi kabre. Ta gomchungi shirap sedu kare gomkugore seyundu jir ngabo tamche ki nisultang jirado tene kasu babalata lu ngebe nilukdang sim ngebe ki niluk nibode tawe ngosheba chegyudang tene gombe gyunkyongwe koni gomkugore seni tishu bekabre ta de nani ani lu ngebe niluk dan chidang de shusini sim ngebe niluk seni tene shu bekabre.
We are looking at the stages of the path, the general stages of the path, and specifically the stages of the Mahamudra path. And there we have reached the point of the wisdom that we all need to engender in order to realize the path. The wisdom is threefold, and right now we're still looking at the third type of wisdom, or insight, the one that arises from meditation. If we ask meditation on what is the object of our practice of meditation? Well, generally, it's the nature of all phenomena. But more specifically, here we are concerned with the two types of this nature, or the natural state of the bodies, the forms, and of the mind. And we are discussing those two from the perspective of how we can resolve that nature by means of the view, and how can we sustain that realization by means of our practice of meditation. So among these two aspects of meditating on the nature of body and the mind, we have finished the first one, and now we're looking at the nature and realization of the nature of the mind.
Dasim ngobu niluk di tani karire sini tegar samotang baina semge ranshin wesalwa tang tongba sungdu jubam saldong sungju gyudebra shebi nyingbu ranchun yishe sita tinzu chasang mingi namranchi chate gyuri.
What is the nature of the mind? If we were to give a very straightforward answer, we'll just say the nature of the mind is luminosity. Elaborating further on it, we will have to say that it's actually the unity of clarity and emptiness. We also call it by different names such as Buddha nature or self-arisen wakefulness.
Inayanda kasu baba di dende sadong sunju ki sim ngebe niluk di dene nganzu nyamlen la charnyang gomi yongdu taiwe kantis tenla pap kugare gombe kantis nyamsu len kugare esani ta dende zo ni koni lamshimba di ndo kugare esani ta denzu shube kabre.
And in the previous Dharma session, we started already discussing how we can resolve that nature of the mind, that unity of clarity and emptiness by means of the view. And how can we sustain that realization of that unity of the nature of the mind with our practice of meditation. So that's where we have left off in the previous Dharma session. We'll continue from starting from here as well.
Tade kasang anzu tunda zubudi tini sumrawa chi anzu sambo tangku kare sech. Tangbo di sangye ki tini shirchingi doye ki nangla sem machi te sem ki rangshin wesaba wo se de sumba te nangla duni tini anzu sem ngabe nilu di nyamsu lingu kore. Dela dini nawa tamche sem yinpa tenla papa sem tongbar tenla papa dini tongba sungju kam ime tu tenla papa sani yungu yore la dini gom yongbe kapsa yang rinpa dini chini gom nin doku yore sani da deshu bare.
And in the previous Dharma session, I have explained that when it comes to meditating on the nature of mind, we should look at the 3 steps. There are 3 aspects, the ones that the Buddha elucidated in his famous statement in Prajnaparamita, the 8,000 verses Prajnaparamita, such as for the mind, there is no mind. The nature of the mind is luminosity. So it is these 3 points from this statement that we need to really meditate upon and gain experience with. So if we were to translate, so to say, those 3 points that the Buddha have stated into the actual stages of the path, like how can we meditate on that? Well, first stage is to realize that all phenomena are the mind. The next one is to realize that the mind itself is empty by essence. And then to realize the third step, the third stage is to realize that emptiness is itself is non-dual unity. So when it comes to meditating on stages of the path, on the nature of the mind, these are those 3 stages that we have discussed in the previous Dharma session.
Da dela tini kasang anzu dogin nangla tini sung yo batang kapsu babi anzu chachi molangi kapsu la tini tawa tenla pabi kapsu la kandi sung yo batang chikche te tini gombe nyamsu lembe kapsu la kandis nyamsu lingu kuyo re se di namba niki kwani tini sambatangu kuyo re se ne kasang tishu bare.
Likewise, yesterday in Tibetan it's the same. In the previous Dharma session, I have explained that we can also take this statement made by the Buddha in the Prajnaparamita Sutra and look at it through the lens of the Mahamudra practice, right? And we do that by, first of all, looking at that statement by means of how can we really resolve it, ascertain it with our view. And then how can we meditate on what the Buddha stated and sustain that in our practice of meditation, right? And here the view and the practice of meditation could also be explained from the perspective of Mahamudra, right? Thus, we're looking at the Mahamudra aspiration prayer.
다데 나니 가상 타와테나 파베 갑술라 도기 셈라 셈마치데 숨베긴 도긴 공된디 되니 직지 춘음 탐제 셈기 남들때 셈네 셈에 셈영어외동 동시 마가 지양 나왔대 레버턴이 시저쳐버려 쇼세 긴데 갑술라 세강 당보디기 나와 셈임바당 지강 이바디기 셈 뭐에 마투바 동바 임바당 되니 숨바디기 낭동 송주 다웨기 땐라 팝고거래 시자초고거래 타초고거래 니시기고거래 대중성화이나 된 다웨규라 깨바스니 세교레스니 대슈바래.
Likewise, in the previous Dharma session, I have explained that when it comes to resolving the view of what the Buddha stated, that there is, as for the mind there is no mind, the nature of the mind is luminosity. From the point of view of the philosophical view, we can and we should resolve it in the following three steps, three stages. And we can find those explained in the 9th verse of the Mahamudra aspiration prayer that reads that all phenomena are the illusory display of mind. There is no mind. Mind is empty of an essence. Empty and unceasing, it appears as anything whatsoever. Investigating this thoroughly, may we ascertain the ground. Right. So let's look at the statement itself. As for the mind, right? That's the first one here. Well, here we have to resolve that all phenomena are the mind. And that's what is explained in the first line of the Mahamudra aspiration prayer. All phenomena are the illusory display of mind. There is no mind, right? The second aspect of the statement. Well, here, the second line of this verse reads, there is no mind. Mind is empty of an essence. And when it comes to the nature of the mind as luminosity, the third aspect of the statement, here, Mahamudra tradition, we talk about, as the verse states, it's empty and unceasing. It appears as anything whatsoever. So here, the text points to this unity of emptiness and unceasing dependent origination of phenomena. And what we have to do really is that when it comes to resolving the view is that we have to ascertain it. We have to decide upon it. We have to gain certainty that this is the case. Right? Then when we really have that certainty, when we have ascertained that this is the ground, this is how things are, that we can say that, well, we have really generated the proper view.
Tani nadirin nipa tindeki tawa tenla papshapati gombe nyamsulembe kapsula kandislingu go resni tadela chidang shineki koni tini tang tadik cheba chidang tini laudongge kapsula ngösu shisa chebe koni nyamsu langsu yusini rimba nida bashsumere tadinani tada ni laudongge kapsula tini kandisini shiza chebe koni 냠스 링크거레스니 숭바디 쉐이.
And today we'll continue then with the second approach. That is, after we have resolved that by means of our view, how can we sustain that, right? That certainty, that realization by means of our practice of meditation. And here, when it comes to meditation, we always differentiate between two practices. One is the shamatha or calm abiding, and another one is vipassana or clear insight. With shamatha, we sort of prepare our minds to develop that clear, penetrative insight, clear seeing of vipassana. And so today I would love then to explain how we can practice vipassana, that clear, penetrative insight, practice it in relation to what we have ascertained, right? What we have investigated thoroughly and what we have really resolved with our view, right? Previously with the view, we have ascertained the ground, what we just mentioned earlier. So now the question is, how can we sustain that, what we have really ascertained with our practice of meditation, right? And so that's what we will discuss today.
라동게 값을라 지제 간디 숭요레스나 율라 때베 율미 셈소통 셈라 때베 셈메 ngobe통 니라 때베 니진 랑서시 웨설 셈기 네룩 똑바쇼스니 데리스 숭요.
Which verse from the Mahamudra's Preparation Prayer points out to this practice of Vipassana clear insight? It's verse 18 that reads, looking at objects, there are no objects. We see only mind. Looking at mind, there is no mind. It is empty of an essence. Looking at both, the holistic clinging is spontaneously liberated. May we realize luminosity, the true nature of mind.
Tadi dini chidang ngansu lojongdang tinzu ke kapsula yang dini tinzu kola mawu sungere sikte tawudi korimdi kyongsuldi pena lojong dindume kapsula chenam milam taburasam maki rikbi shila che nyembo nigyang rangsar dul ngo kunshi ngala shaasni dini sungere na dinzo ya dordina nawa rangshi matuba sem tongba tang tongba wasalam sungju ke kangla nyambar shabe koni tenla pabe koni nyambar shaku gore sini sungbare de nashi danga su namkyun yongda lojong ki shung jinlap jin gyase lalen kapsula yangdani jidra nawa deda rangi semni dweni dwebi tatang dal dengi sheni sungjin tsema nam yila mije gyase lalen yin sungere tenju tunda dawre jidra nawa deda rangi sem sidi sama tordina da nawa di tatamje sem tsammam sem la tembare seji nawa semin bade sunguyare semni dweni trebi tatang dal sungeti dendeki nangken ta nyongking sem khorang yang ani tongbare sini sungbare dingi sheni sungjen semanam yila meshe sungeti dordina chi sungwa yuldang de zinken ki sem niga yang don la dini zinken chigda sungja dawa chig yul matube yuljen tang yuljen la matube yul da rangshin matuba yindu niga yang rangshin matuba sita nga zo nyamba nyi segire dini choke korangi taduki kiji sheba sungjuk segire tunda chigbare nga zo sungjuk tu tok saya tang sungzin ime tu tok saya di tunda daware ine yanda 송진 이미도 또서도 또저 지양 고아디 디슬레라라고 봐 송주도 또서도 니디 지기인바 하고 그래 신수로 되니도 봐 송진 이미도 또서도 되니 된대기 순외게 율당 짐바 심니부디 니징이 샤샤바 나신기 도저 두제그 주도 나신 마두바인바 하고 봐도라 니 섬당 거고요 사례 다 돌드나 되니 로종게 값을란 쳔나 밀람답을 삼세디 대가랑레 나왔으면 바세디
This, what was just stated in the Mahmud Respiration Prayer, we can also find this kind of statements, this kind of pointing out instructions in other treatises. For example, we can see very similar explanation of how to practice in it in the mind training, right? So especially here, we're talking about the 7-point seven points mind training, where the root text states, consider all dharmas as dreamlike. Examine the nature of unborn awareness. Let even the antidote be freed in its own place. Rest in the alaya, the essence of the path. So this is the teaching on ultimate bodhicitta, right, from the 7 points mind training, where we can see exactly the same stages of the path, where first consider all dharmas as dreamlike. This is same to say that consider all appearances to be the mind. Whereas the second line here states, examine the nature of unborn awareness, while the mind itself is unborn. In other words, the mind itself is emptiness, right? Same as before. Let even the antidote be freed in its own place. Rest in the alaya, the essence of the path. So emptiness, right, itself is the unity, and we need to rest in that unity. Likewise, in the extremely well-known text, the very blessed text, the 37 practices of bodhisattvas, we also see the same stages on meditating on the nature of the mind, sustaining that realization of the nature of the mind. In the verse 22, that reads, whatever appears is all one's own mind. Mind itself is primordially beyond all mental constructs. Knowing this, it is the practice of the bodhisattvas not to hold on to any attributes of perceiver and perceived. So whatever appears is all one's own mind. Again, this is the same as the first stage of meditating on the mind, where we see that all appearances are just merely the mind itself. They arise based on the mind, arise in the domain of the mind. The text continues the 37 practices. The next line states, mind itself is primordially beyond all mental constructs, where the mind itself, the one that experiences all phenomena, the one that perceives those all appearances, that experiencer itself is emptiness, right? Being free of mental constructs, it's same as the great shunyata, emptiness. And now the third stage is what we have to do is just not to hold on to any attributes of perceiver and perceived. In other words, here we have to realize that what is perceived, the objects, and the mind that perceives them, that is to say the apprehended and the apprehender, they are mutually interdependent phenomena. They're mutually designated. Without perceiver, we cannot have the perceived. Without the perceived, we cannot have the perceiver. And thus we can see, because they are in this way mutually interdependent, they are not truly existent in and of themselves. Right? The perceiver and perceived are lacking any inherent nature of their own. And this we call equality. Or we can also call it unity, as we have been calling it previously. However, I think it's actually here, it's even easier for us, for our mind to understand, what is this equality when we speak of it as non-duality of perceiver and perceived. Right? This is a bit easier for our minds to comprehend, this non-duality of perceiver and perceived, right? This mutual designation of perceiver and perceived. It's easier than speaking of this term unity, right? Because whenever we say unity, it sounds like there are two things and we're trying to establish that they are one, right? But that's kind of 2 equals 1. That's hard for us to process. Well, anyway, in short, whether we look at the 7 points mind training, right, that once again states that consider all dharmas as dreamlike, examine the nature of unborn awareness, and so on, right? Or we consult the 37 practices of bodhisattvas, and we see that here again we establish that all appearances are the mind itself beyond mental constructs, right? And then rest in that non-duality of perceiver and perceived. All of this points out exactly to the same 3 stages that we need to go through when it comes to sustaining at certainty, that realization of the nature of the mind.
Dini da khasang chenam tamchi semgi namtul tesni sungmanan shingi tanda kapsu baba telayan dini lagdongi shiza chepe kapsula kari sungayresena da gombe nyamsu lenyongdu semla chani nyamsu lenyongdu tangbodi yulla tebe yulme semsu tong se di sungbare da rinpa sumyarwa pena khasa doye nangla semla se di digi tundati ane ngaransu gomi yongdu nyamsu la yongdu karis langko goresena yulla tebe yulme semsu tong se ni nawa sem yinba se di tadi zo karis sungo yoresena ngaransu wangbo yore 아니 율열에 된대게 왕보다 율니디 태용배 값을라 넘버 쉐바지 게용거래 넘버 쉐바들라 동면열에 이내한다 남주영아란수 망 쉐베긴 되샤 쉐당 디무 세디 차상디 조 동면기 쉐바 레강 락바 똑제기 쉐바 든줄로 고고거래 아주 이기 쉐바와 디야보도 딩엠바도 디야보도 나라고도 디두부리샤 나라 고금이도 삼베기 차단가 로차상디 로토제기 지겨래 dordinanda yul suk dawajila sudadire chala soba mangboyare andeta ki la tenin chungsha be namdo mangboji ki yongore ane ngarang su tande chalata yul sedi yul khara rangwen tuba yimba chita tini di shekengi lo sedi khagaji yimbata da khandar semle 타데비게 나와 유랑은 두바 임바지 맞아 쇼shum 보인 거예요. 내 임바 송자 아니 되샤기 온데 되샤디 슉 첨버지다. 탁버지. 아니 셰당기 온데야. 셰당디 슉 첨버지다 탁버지. 된대기더니 녀몽 딱 한달 댄진 니진 센진 아니 림바신도 대다 탐지수 너무 용도 안한솔라 semgi tenla da kanda chik sem mashiwa da sem tu dwe ke namdo tiri shukchumbo chiki yung goyo re da tenzu chasangde yulla tebe yulme semsu tong se di yul semsu 마통 용도 율든 두바딜라 슉 첨버지 짐바차니 니진 슉 첨버지 중용도 되니 내 나신기 차단대야 슉 첨버지 기인 거예요. 다디가레스나 림바 땅보 나와 셈임바 하마고 용도 아니 니몽몽부 되듯이 샤르는 거예요. 제자 다 나와 셈임바 하고야디 내가 첨버지 차대요.
Going back to the Mahamudra aspiration prayer, where verse 18 right, explains how we can meditate on this nature of the mind in terms of 3 stages by practicing vipassana. So the first line here, looking at objects, there are no objects. We see only mind. Right, looking at objects, there are no objects. We see only mind. This is kind of in the same line with the first line of verse 9 that we have been talking about in previous Dharma session when it comes to resolving that first stage by means of the view, where it says all phenomena are the illusory display of mind. So all phenomena are the illusory display of mind. Now the instruction is how to sustain that is by looking at objects and seeing that there are no objects, that what is there, it's only mind. If we go back to the first stage from this, sutric statement of the Buddha, as for the mind, right? The first stage there. So as for the mind, how do we meditate on it? Well, by looking at objects and examining whether there are actually objects out there or not. So what happens generally for us is that we have a faculty, like eye faculty, and whenever an object such as a form presents itself, right, we have a consciousness, like eye consciousness, visual consciousness that arises, and so on. We have other 5 sense consciousnesses arising when the respective faculty meets with its object. Those 5 sense consciousnesses are non-conceptual, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, so on. But what happens is that, we don't just stay there in that non-conceptual kind of just pure perception of the object. What happens is that on top of that, we give rise to the mental consciousness, the one that evaluates, do I like this object or not? Or if I like, I want to have it, or I don't like, right? Then I want to get rid of it. That kind of speculation happens on the level of the 6, or the 6 consciousness, mental one, where all those disturbing emotions kind of dwell, or afflictive emotions dwell. And that one is conceptual. Unlike the 5 sense consciousnesses, the mental consciousness is conceptual. We have a lot of kind of ideations. I like, I don't like. In other words, attachments and aversions are very much rooted in that kind of mental consciousness. Right? We see a form, and then we have a lot of those kind of speculations, thoughts. Now, how to cut through it? We need to look at that form and that object and see, is it really truly out there? Objectively, so to say, right? Is it something separately established, separately from the mind, existence separately from the mind? Right? Or not? Of course, for most of us, because of our extremely strong habitual tendencies, we perceive those objects being out there. These kind of patterns are deeply entrenched, embedded in our psychic, and so we really think it's that out there. And because it's really there and it's real, so to say, that's how we perceive it, we also have a very real sense of anger, for example, towards that object. And from that, we further develop different types of grasping, the grasping to true existence, right? The coarse one. Then we have the grasping to duality, right? It's out there, separately from me. The grasping to subtle characteristics of that object. So what to do? Well, as for the mind, the Buddha said. Now look at this first line from verse 18. Looking at objects, there are no objects. We see only mind. when we really don't perceive those objects being out there, something distinct from the mind, as being truly existent out there objectively, right, then there will be also accordingly no strong clinging, and no those kind of ideations of liking, disliking, and thus those afflictive emotions, intense afflictive emotions of attachment, desire, aversion, anger will collapse. So therefore, this first stage, the instruction is, again, when it comes to appearances, it's absolutely of utmost importance to resolve and then sustain that in our practice of meditation, that appearances are the mind. What we see is only our own mind.
Dorduna digi karisung baresena sukta diro zemize gamika la sopa susu ku semla nawati shar yongdu dine lamsang nawati kin jesu magyu wacheni nawa kwarangi tengdu la teni uni dane ki tende ki zemize dang du midu chi ranshin ki dupa nawa nashin chi du midu sini tozo chi cheba che yongdu dini nawa kasagure yul rangani nawa nashin chi rang ngo ke matu patang gyugin duma chokpala teni ta susu take pangwa maimbe ke marik patang nizin din zukin gyuche teni yul suk la sokpa din zuki kenje teni ge chesho chila ta ngaransu nyumongpa la gomba shukche tatu ani yul chedang la yang mitukpa tong yul chedang la yang dukpa tong susu ki bakcha ki shukchumbo ki wangi tul yongdu tende tordu na yul di rangi matupa rangi marikpa ki tsuwa chebe ki gyugin tuman duba la teni ta ngaransu namkyu chi chulche mangpo chi tsom yongdu ani longnying ki sukdang, dadang tenzu chasang ngonsum yoba nashin chi sharba nashin chi ni sha yoche sha samba tende chi teni samla tang tuba ina tong tuba ina ta yula tebe yulin semsu tong sedi nawa sem yinba sedi ta dus chadu gara dus gomku gara sumbare.
So at the moment when we do see a form, if we think about the visual consciousness, we right away think, we experience this kind of like or dislike, right, that arises strongly in our minds. But at that moment, we need to pause and really try not to follow, and really just spend the moment investigating, is that object, that appearance, is actually what it seems to me to what it seems to be? Is it really beautiful or pleasant, or is it really what my mind claims to be unpleasant or ugly, right? That kind of, is it just a projection of my mind, or is that beauty or ugliness is really established in the object itself? So we need to investigate and see, because we need to look at that object and see that in reality it's nothing but just agglomeration of different causes and conditions coming together on the basis then of my own ignorance. I kind of impute that true existence on that object, but in reality it's really just my own confusion and ignorance that projects that existence onto the object. And it's really that kind of our own projection of seeing it pleasant or unpleasant, which kind of arise, that pleasantness, unpleasantness, ugliness, beauty, really determined by our own tendencies from before, our own habitual patterns from before, right? We're kind of confused, and so we think we really see objectively, but we don't, right? And so what to do is, in short, is that we need to understand that that object is not really existent. It's just a projection of my mind, my ignorant mind, right? That kind of just causes and conditions coming together. For example, like movie. It's a lot of different conditions, kind of causes that need to come together for us to then look at the screen and see all those pixels come together as a picture, as an actual image of a movie with the sound, right? Soundtrack kind of matching that image. We think, oh, it's really real, but in reality, so many small things coming together for us to see that image as a movie. So in the exactly same way here, looking at objects, we need to understand that there are no objects. We see only mind, right? As the Buddha said, as for the mind, right? So the objects are the mind. Or as Mahamudra Respiration Prayer says, all phenomena, the illusory display of mind.
다 도르디나 타와텔나 파베카술라 지다르나와 데다랑기 셈세디 텐라 팝샤와디 아니 카수바베 율라 타운데 율메 임바디 탐제 셈잠도 통화데 가나 냠바샤와데라 카르세거레스나디니 율라 테베 유메심수 통스.
In other words, what we have resolved previously with the view that what we have resolved previously is that all phenomena are the illusory display of mind. Now we need to sustain that realization in our practice of meditation by looking at objects, investigating them over and over again, and seeing that in reality there are no objects. There is only mind, and resting in that. Right here, we're talking about practice of meditation. So we don't just resolve that, but we rest in that certainty. Right? Rest in that understanding that all of this is just the mind.
doyenangla sem machi te sini ta yulme sem su tupa tsamchiki chidang kange mangbuji shidu gore intangi shuba nashi ngana su manche nyumongpa te yang yulme sem su matongwal teni chungu yore la dega nashi ngi teni chiro gyu yuldu dubare sini ichi chimbo kagazu yoba tetsamgi susu ki semla tangzin mebachi ba 아니 강아지지 조규 매바지 용도 봐. 강아 찍세네 양 강아 이바지 못는 용도 봐. 다 나와 셈레세디 니시지 깨바이나. 드니 신에다 율 누구 이난다 미두바 이난다. 디케바민도 나랑게 셈라지 당진지 지도 바이나. 아니 땡땡지 율 뇨다 망보 여근신나라 대바이네야. 나랑게 셈라 러자지 용톱사레 가르레스나 강다리 강이네 마이나고 데자 시단티 무세리 계사디 나랑게 셈니 깨니 파스웨샤바지를 마도 율니 추지 나주 셈나나 주 루샤바다부지 마레도 셈에 삼로지 땅도 바이나 땡땡띠기 지당 강의 뇨타 망보지 세계라 학바도 돼 나주 데자 시단티 무 망보지라 또저지 당진지 되게 뉴바지 나주라 라도고도 봐 디송잔디 게침보 시비차도 라과도다 간주 레당보 바기 지당 림바숨가 도구여데 이내양다 림바 당보 다고데 짤든 제서 다고데다 율라테베 율민심수 통세디 아니 고메디다 나라주기 랭겐 당보 다고데 디차데도 고바 당보 다고데.
So it is with this first stage, where we understand that all appearances are the mind, as the Buddha said, as for the mind, there is only simply the mind. With that step alone, we will be able to cut through a lot of our problems in life, our difficulties, a lot of them will ease, as I've explained, because our pain, the problems arise from our disturbed, afflicted minds. And that disturbed, afflicted minds arise from our belief that there are those truly existent objects that trigger us, right? We think they are really out there. They are truly existent. When we examine them and see that, right, with this first stage, that appearances are just the illusory display of the mind, and we rest in that, then we will be able to control our afflictive emotions. Right? through that, the problems will kind of lessen in our lives. For example, whether we encounter what we previously considered to be a beautiful, pleasant object or not, really ugly and disturbing, right? And therefore we kind of used to run into this kind of like attachment, anger issues. And now we can just rest in our minds, kind of in a very at ease, rest relaxed, because we know, well, beautiful, ugly, pleasant, unpleasant, all of that is really, it's not out there, right? There's no those kind of truly existent objects. And so knowing that and resting in just that certainty, our minds will be much more calm, much more open, and for that we will gain some control over our disturbing emotions. And so really among the 3 stages of this practice for beginners, the emphasis is a lot on the first one, realizing that appearances are the mind. It is kind of our, really, for us, we can't skip that step. It's extremely important. It's our real responsibility at this point to really resolve that, investigate and resolve that, and then rest in that over and over again.
다 공부 니바디 드니 도에게 나라 심 마치데 세송 받기 된다더래. 심 동바르때나 봐봐야지. 다 나와 심수 임바하고도 지당 니몽몽버지 시기여라. 아니 디간로 거미도 심라 러제 숙중버지 딘딘 용거래. 가르에스는다 당신 숙중버지 라와 톱데라와. 이내양 다동다 지바 니진라서버 타바디 다동야 라데 거지 셈세지당 셈라 띠네 중아레샤 삼삼더버지다 셈세디 고란지 라딩 수더버지 여러봐 근데 임바인데다 니바디 셈 마치데세데라 셈라 떼베 셈명업에 똥스니 율 란싱기 마투파 마세 율 징켄다 용켄기 율진 셰바 코랑게 되니 다 도르디나 셈 코랑기 ngo디 간디도스 다치당 남주응한주 입당 카도 치당 낭 예메 된데 세용거래야 세계열에 된데 그림 바용거 다 도르디나 원한다 셈 코랑기 ngo라 따용되더니 셈 코랑기 ngo디야 율랑신 마투바 지바 지견체니 랑신 마투바지 레도 셈베 타치용도 대강라 냠바샤바텔라 안 가르세거르서는더니 셈나테베 셈명어 똥송.
As for the second step, there is no mind, right? As the Buddha said in the sutra, here we establish that the mind itself is emptiness, as we have resolved that with the view previously. And now what we do is for the practice of meditation, as the second line of verse 18 states, looking at mind, there is no mind. It is empty of an essence. So by following through the first stage, that first step, understanding that all appearances are the mind, that already helps us a lot in the way that a lot of our afflictive emotions, disturbing emotions subside when we understand that there is no really truly existent outer objects, and mind is more at ease, more relaxed, and we gain some control over our tendencies. However, it's still not enough because there is still some subtle dualistic fixations that remain, such as, well, the mind itself is there, right? Appearances are the mind, but the mind is there. And to counteract that kind of dualistic fixation, that grasping, we need to look at mind and see that there is no mind, right? It is empty of an essence. So here we examine the experiencer of those objects of appearances, the perceiver itself, and look what is its essence. Generally, we go through the different types of investigations, analysis, such as what is its color, what is its shape, is it outside, is it inside, where does it reside, where does it come from, where does it go, right? There are those kind of steps that we take to examine the mind itself. And at the end, we arrive perhaps at that certainty that just as the objects, that just as the appearances are not truly existent, the mind itself is also emptiness. And then we rest in that recognition, we rest in that certainty.
somebody dini ta semji rangshin wasaba wase di chati gore ani di tanda kasu baba ni la tebe ni zin rangsar tul se digiti gore ni la tebe sidi samanda nawa sem yimbatang sem khwarang yang ngowe matuba shime chatali yimbati hago yongdu dini nika ronyamdu da ronyam ewa chigyu mebatang dejo yimba parimena tsuri meba nashinjini dinde yimba chig ta choba dela dini ronyamdu nyambar shago kore sungbari dini nyambar sha yongdu yu jingi zimba tamje rangsarla doldu kore rangsar dol sungdu da kandara yu jingi zimba di korang rangshingi dini meba chadu kore ladu kore yedu kore sungbari di dini nilan tebe nizin rangsar dol se da di nizin rangsar dol se tang nangsim ronyamdu nyambar sha se tang dini doki nangla simgi rangshin wesawa sungye dang tuzi sha sangdita tsik dos minda mato dunda jiba chadege sari.
And now we continue with the third stage, where the sutra states that the nature of the mind is luminosity, and here in the Mahamudra aspiration prayer is for the instruction how to meditate on it. Is for the instruction on how to meditate on it. It reads, looking at both, dualistic clinging is spontaneously liberated. So that's the instruction here. Looking at both. At what? Well, looking at appearances being the mind and the mind itself being not truly existent. Right? Being with, the mind itself being without a ground or a basis. We see then, we realize, we experience equal taste. That is to say, equal taste that we cannot differentiate the object, subject, such as, just like without something being right here, we cannot establish something being out there, right? Without here, there is no there. Without object, there is no subject. So we rest in that equality, in that equal taste, where all dualistic clinging spontaneously liberated. So all this kind of dualistic fixation, clinging to object, subject, subsides by itself. It's self-liberated. It fades away. So we can call it then, right, luminosity, the true nature of mind. We call it resting in equal taste, or in one taste, resting in this one taste. Or, as the Buddha in the Sutra said, the nature of the mind is luminosity. So it's all the same, kind of with all different, it's the different terms, but they point out to the same meaning, right? The nature of the mind is luminosity, or one taste, or all clinging, dualistic clinging spontaneously liberated, right? That's where we need to rest when it comes to the third final stage, practice here.
Sigang tama wasal semgi niluk tobar show se didini dordina semgi niluk de kariresna semgi ranshin wasawati semgi nilu chati geres dini di dendegi semgi nilu di kandis toko geresna da kongdo shiba nanshin taweki nawa semyimba lasoba tenla pap dini gombeki yul meba semsu tong sem ngowa tongba yinba hako ni tindegi dini niga la tayong dini nisin din dol tap deta bam lamji rinba tawa tenla paba tang gomba nyamsu lemba di nibu la tenni dini ngarangsu tanda rangyu la yobeki ta semji rangshin wesalbaam dini gyud dewara shepe nyingbaam rangjungi ishe de ani jidawara tobeki ladongi sherabam gomjungi sherab degi dini tokogo yarala kasu babada ladongi ishe tindedi rangi ki gyulai kebara shoosani dini malamga tsiksung shakwaredwa.
The fourth line from this verse 18 reads, "May we realize luminosity, the true nature of mind." May we realize luminosity, right? So when we go through the stages, we see that appearances are the mind. There is no mind. The nature of mind is luminosity. So that's the process that's kind of the stages how we need to realize that what we are praying here for, making aspirations for. Right? First, we resolve it, ascertain it with the view, philosophical view, understanding that appearances are the mind. The mind itself is emptiness. Emptiness is unity. We ascertain that. And then we meditate on that certainty. We put it into practice. We rest in that. Looking at objects, seeing the mind. Looking at mind, realizing emptiness. Looking at both, and all the dualistic clinging is self-liberates, fades away by itself. Right? That's the process. That's the way. That's the stages of how we have to realize that the nature of the mind is luminosity. It's Buddha nature, it's self-arisen wakefulness. And that realization, that's what we call vipassana, that clear insight, is exactly the third type of wisdom, the one that arises from practice of meditation.
Naso, dan dorduna kasanganzu semnepe nilu di dini tawe tenla papa tang gombeki gyun kyongsul di dini sanjegin doikin nala sungshaba di dini kasu baba ta kasang tawe tenla papsu di kasang shubari ani gombe nyamsul linsul di dini kasu babi ki tsikji diki tingi yores deyang dini yul tamje rangnang sem ngo zamdu 통거바디 당보당 아니 심 과랑기 ngo버디 따용도 가도 입라 속바 강야랑 신경 주바 땡김매바 시멘살럽도 도기대당 니 타마르 딘데기 유해진 이보다 내야더니 로냠도 또베긴 탑 딘데라 떼니 곰베긴 탑 딘데라 떼니더니 심기 내룩 워사와디 먼저 제고 그래 했어야 된다. 가스바비게 돈다 디네도 템바레 숨바레다 되게 돌디나 즉시 가상 엄마되게 따왔대나 밥술당 아니 단다 즉시 니바되기 건배냠수 렌술디 템바레스.
Well then, in short for today, we have been looking at, in the last actually Dharma sessions, in the previous and today, we have been looking at the nature of the mind. In the previous Dharma session, we have looked at how we can ascertain it with our view. Today, we have looked at how we can meditate on it, sustain that certainty, that realization with our practice of meditation, right? The verse 18 explains that. So in this way, that first of all, to kind of again to just encapsulate all what we have been looking at, well, we start by resolving with our view that objects are just the self-display of the mind. Then we look at the mind and we investigate whether there is a shape of the so-called mind, color, basis or ground where it arises, right? And we don't find that. Looking at the mind, we can't find it. And we look at both the object, the appearances, and the mind, and realize that they are of one equal taste. And so that's what we sustain with our practice of meditation. That's what we actualize with our practice of meditation, right? That's what we have discussed today. In this way, verse 9 explained how to certain that with the view, and we did that in a previous Dharma session. And today we looked at verse 18 from the Mahamudra Inspiration Prayer and looked at how we can meditate on that and sustain that realization. So that's it for today.
Janju Simju Rimbo Je Magye Banam Ge Gyure Je Geba Nyamba Mebare Gone Gondo Pelabare Sho